Welcome to Reading Bear. Today we've got a story where OP's entitled neighbor Karen blocks their driveway and dares them to call parking enforcement. I never thought I'd be the type of person to get into a neighborhood feud, but here we are. This whole mess started about 6 months ago when new neighbors moved in next door. The house had been empty for almost a year before they showed up, so I was actually looking forward to having people living there again. The family seemed normal enough at first. A husband, wife, and 2 teenage kids. The husband worked some kind of office job and was rarely around during the day. The kids were typical teenagers, always on their phones and generally kept to themselves. But the wife, let's call her Karen because she absolutely fits the stereotype, turned out to be something else entirely. Our houses sit on a corner lot situation where my driveway runs along the side of my property, and their driveway is directly across from mine on their side. There's maybe 15 feet between our driveways, which has always been plenty of space for both households to navigate in and out without any issues. I've lived here for 8 years and never had a single problem with the previous neighbors. The first sign of trouble came during their second week in the house. I came home from work one evening to find Karen's silver SUV parked right at the end of my driveway. Not completely blocking it, but positioned in a way that made it incredibly tight for me to pull in. I figured it was just a mistake. Maybe she didn't realize how close she was parked to my entrance. I knocked on their door and politely mentioned it to her. She seemed apologetic enough and moved the car right away. I thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't. The next week, same thing happened. This time she was parked even closer to my driveway entrance. When I approached her about it, she was less apologetic and more defensive. She claimed she wasn't actually blocking anything and that there was plenty of room for me to get in. Technically, she was right. I could squeeze in, but I had to do some serious maneuvering to avoid scraping her car or mine. This pattern continued for the next month. Every few days, I'd come home to find her SUV parked in that exact spot. Each time I talked to her about it, she became more argumentative. She started saying things like how the street was public property and she could park wherever she wanted as long as she wasn't actually in my driveway. The situation really escalated one afternoon when I was trying to back out of my driveway for a doctor's appointment. Her SUV was parked so close that I couldn't make the turn without potentially hitting it. I was already running late, so I knocked on her door to ask her to move it. That's when Karen really showed her true colors. She opened the door with this smug expression and basically told me that she wasn't moving her car for my convenience. She said I should learn to drive better if I couldn't navigate around a properly parked vehicle. She actually used the phrase, "not my problem," about 3 times during our conversation. I tried explaining that I was late for a medical appointment and really needed her to just move the car for 5 minutes so I could get out. Her response was to suggest I should have left earlier if I was worried about being late. The lack of basic human decency was just stunning. I ended up having to call my doctor's office and reschedule because by the time Karen finally decided to move her car, which took another 20 minutes of back and forth, it was too late to make my appointment. That incident made me realize this wasn't just inconsiderate parking. This was deliberate. Karen had figured out that parking in that spot inconvenienced me, and she was doing it on purpose. I started paying more attention to her parking patterns, and sure enough, she only parked there when my car was in the driveway. If my driveway was empty, she'd park normally in front of her own house or in her own driveway. I decided to document everything. I started taking photos whenever she parked there, noting the dates and times. I also began researching the local parking ordinances to understand exactly what the rules were. What I discovered was interesting. According to city code, it's actually illegal to park within 5 feet of a driveway entrance, even on a public street. The rule exists specifically to ensure residents can safely enter and exit their driveways without obstruction. Karen's SUV was consistently parked about 3 feet from my driveway entrance. Armed with this information, I tried one more diplomatic approach. I printed out the relevant section of the parking code and walked over to show it to Karen. I explained that her parking was actually violating city ordinance and asked if she could please park elsewhere. Her reaction was predictable but still infuriating. She looked at the paper I'd brought, laughed, and told me she didn't care about some stupid rule. She said parking enforcement in our neighborhood was practically non-existent and that I could call them all I wanted. Nothing would happen. Then she said something that really set me off. She told me that maybe if I was nicer to her, she might consider parking somewhere else. But since I was being such a pain about it, she was going to continue parking wherever she wanted. The entitlement was just breathtaking. She was essentially admitting that she was breaking parking rules specifically to annoy me. And now she was trying to extort better treatment from me in exchange for basic courtesy. That's when I decided to take a different approach. If Karen wanted to play games with parking enforcement, I was going to give her exactly what she was asking for. The next morning, I called the city's parking enforcement division. I explained the situation to the supervisor and was told that they do patrol residential areas, but usually only in response to complaints. They suggested I file a formal complaint each time the violation occurred, and they would dispatch someone when possible. Here's where the malicious compliance comes in. Karen had specifically told me that I could call parking enforcement all I wanted and nothing would happen. She was daring me to try. So I decided to take her up on that challenge, but not in the way she expected. Instead of just calling when it was convenient for me, I decided to call every single time her car was illegally parked. And I mean every single time. If she parked there for 10 minutes, I called. If she parked there for 2 hours, I called. If she moved her car and then parked there again the same day, I called again. I also started timing my calls strategically. Karen usually parked in the problem spot around the same times each day, late morning after her husband left for work, mid-afternoon, and early evening. I began scheduling my day around being home during these times specifically, so I could document the violations and call them in immediately. The city parking enforcement operates on a complaint-driven system, which means they prioritize areas where they receive multiple complaints. What Karen didn't realize when she told me to go ahead and call all I wanted was that I was exactly the type of person who would do precisely that. Within the first week of my new strategy, I had filed 12 separate parking violation complaints. I was polite but persistent with the parking enforcement office, always providing the exact address, time, and nature of the violation. I sent them the photos I'd been taking as supporting documentation. Initially, the parking enforcement officer who responded was skeptical. This was clearly a neighbor dispute, and they deal with those all the time. Most people file a complaint or two and then give up when nothing changes immediately. But I wasn't most people. I kept detailed records of every complaint I filed, including reference numbers and the names of the officers I spoke with. When they told me they'd patrol the area when possible, I started asking specific questions about their patrol schedule and response times. I wasn't rude about it, just extremely thorough and persistent. The breakthrough came during week 3 of my campaign. I happened to be home when a parking enforcement officer actually showed up to check on one of my complaints. Karen's SUV was, predictably, parked illegally at the end of my driveway. The officer measured the distance, confirmed the violation, and issued a ticket. But here's the thing Karen didn't anticipate. I was just getting started. The parking enforcement officer, Officer Martinez, turned out to be just as detail-oriented as I was. After issuing that first ticket, he explained that repeat parking violations in the same location trigger increased monitoring. He told me that if I continued documenting violations, they would step up patrol frequency in the area. So that's exactly what I did. Every day, like clockwork, I monitored Karen's parking. Every violation got photographed, time-stamped, and reported. I created a systematic approach that would have made any project manager proud. I even started noting additional details that might be relevant. For example, I discovered that Karen's SUV was also occasionally parked facing the wrong direction on our street, which is another violation. Sometimes she parked more than 12 inches from the curb. A few times, her vehicle was actually protruding into the crosswalk at the corner. What I was essentially doing was conducting a comprehensive audit of Karen's parking behavior and reporting every single infraction to the appropriate authorities. Karen had told me to call parking enforcement all I wanted, so I was complying with her directive as literally as possible. The results were spectacular. After that first ticket, Karen initially doubled down on her behavior. She actually started parking even more aggressively, positioning her SUV as close to my driveway as possible without technically being in it. She seemed to think that one ticket was no big deal and that she could intimidate me into backing down. What she didn't realize was that increased parking enforcement attention meant more tickets, not fewer. Officer Martinez began patrolling our street regularly, and he had developed an eye for the subtle violations Karen was committing. The second ticket came just 4 days after the first one, then another one 3 days after that. By the end of the first month of my systematic reporting campaign, Karen had accumulated 7 parking tickets. Each ticket was for a different violation: parking too close to a driveway, parking facing the wrong direction, parking too far from the curb, blocking a crosswalk. The fines started at $75 each, but they increase for repeat offenses in the same area. Karen's attitude began to shift around ticket number 5. She started parking more carefully, measuring distances and double-checking her positioning. But she still hadn't figured out that the simplest solution was to just park in front of her own house or in her own driveway. Her husband approached me around this time. He was clearly embarrassed by the situation and tried to mediate. He explained that Karen was stressed about the move and adjusting to the new neighborhood. He asked if there was some kind of compromise we could work out. I actually felt bad for the guy. He seemed genuinely nice and was obviously caught in the middle of his wife's stubborn behavior. But Karen had made this personal when she started deliberately inconveniencing me, and then escalated it by being so dismissive and rude about the parking ordinance. I told him that the solution was simple. Karen just needed to park legally. I wasn't asking her to park in any specific spot, just to follow the same parking rules that everyone else had to follow. If she parked legally, there wouldn't be any tickets. He nodded and said he'd talk to her. I thought maybe that would be the end of it. But Karen apparently didn't appreciate her husband's intervention. The next day, she parked illegally in the same spot and left her car there for 6 hours. It was like she was proving a point about not being told what to do. So I proved my own point by filing 3 separate violation reports that day, as her car violated different ordinances throughout the day. Officer Martinez issued 2 more tickets. The escalation continued for another month. Karen would park illegally. I would report it. She would get ticketed. She tried different variations, parking legally for a few days and then reverting to the old spot, or parking legally in the morning but illegally in the afternoon. But I was consistent in my reporting, and parking enforcement was consistent in their responses. The turning point came when Karen accumulated her 15th parking ticket. At this point, the fines had escalated significantly due to the repeat offense provisions in the city code. What started as $75 tickets had become $150 tickets, then $225 tickets. But the real shock came when Karen received a notice that her vehicle was being flagged as a chronic parking violator. After 15 tickets in the same area for similar violations, the city had classified her as a habitual offender. This meant that future tickets would carry even higher fines and that her vehicle could potentially be impounded for repeated violations. Karen finally cracked. She came storming over to my house one evening, waving the chronic violator notice in her hand. She was angrier than I'd ever seen her, practically shouting about how I was ruining her life over a parking space. She accused me of harassment, of being petty and vindictive. She said I was calling parking enforcement too much and that it wasn't normal behavior. She demanded that I stop reporting her parking violations. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I very calmly explained that I was simply doing exactly what she had told me to do. She had specifically said that I could call parking enforcement all I wanted and that nothing would happen. I was just following her advice and reporting parking violations when I observed them. I reminded her that all she had to do to stop getting tickets was to park legally. The solution had always been completely within her control. Karen's response was to threaten to call the police on me for harassment. I told her that was her choice, but that I was well within my rights to report parking violations to the appropriate authorities. I suggested that if she called the police, they would probably just tell her the same thing: park legally and there won't be any tickets. She stormed off, but not before telling me that this wasn't over. She was right about that, but not in the way she expected. The next few weeks were actually quiet. Karen started parking in her own driveway or in front of her own house. No more tickets were issued. I thought maybe she had finally learned her lesson. But then I started noticing other things. Karen began filing complaints about me with the homeowners association. She complained that my grass was too long. It wasn't. That I was storing trash cans in an inappropriate location. I wasn't. And that my car was leaking oil on the street. It wasn't. Every complaint was investigated and found to be without merit. But it was clear that Karen was trying to retaliate by making my life difficult in other ways. She also started being passive-aggressive in other ways. She would glare at me whenever she saw me outside. She started playing music loudly in her backyard during the day. She began scheduling lawn care services for very early in the morning, right outside my bedroom window. But the parking situation remained resolved, so I didn't escalate things further. Karen was being petty, but she wasn't breaking any laws or ordinances with these new behaviors. That changed when Karen's teenage son got his driver's license. Apparently, Karen had been teaching her son that parking rules were more like suggestions than actual laws. One afternoon, I came home to find the kid's beat-up Honda Civic parked in the same problematic spot where Karen used to park her SUV. When I went over to talk to Karen about it, she was smugly triumphant. She told me that the car belonged to her son, not her, and that I couldn't do anything about it. She said her son was legally allowed to park on a public street, and that if I had a problem with it, I should talk to him directly. I asked to speak with her son, and she refused. She said he was busy and didn't need to be bothered by neighborhood parking drama. She suggested that maybe I should just learn to live with inconvenience, since that's what living in a community was about. The hypocrisy was stunning. Karen had spent months deliberately inconveniencing me, and then fought tooth and nail against any consequences. Now, she was lecturing me about community living and accepting inconvenience. But she had also just made a critical error. By explicitly telling me to handle the parking issue directly with her son, she was giving me permission to treat this as a separate matter from our previous dispute. So that's exactly what I did. I started documenting the son's parking violations with the same systematic approach I'd used for Karen. Every illegal parking incident was photographed, time-stamped, and reported to parking enforcement. The son, however, was even less sophisticated about his parking violations than Karen had been. He would park illegally and leave the car there for hours at a time. Sometimes he'd park in the morning before school and not move the car until evening. Officer Martinez was still patrolling our street regularly due to the previous issues with Karen's parking. When the son's violations started appearing in the system, Officer Martinez treated them as separate infractions but maintained the same level of attention. The tickets started accumulating quickly. Unlike Karen, who had at least tried to be strategic about her illegal parking, the son just parked wherever was convenient and didn't think about consequences. Within 6 weeks, the son had racked up 12 parking tickets. The fines were adding up quickly. And since these were being issued to a different vehicle with a different registered owner, they didn't benefit from any previous payment arrangements Karen might have made. The son, being a teenager, initially didn't understand the seriousness of the situation. He treated the tickets as a minor annoyance and didn't bother telling his parents about most of them. This became a problem when the city sent a final notice for unpaid tickets to the address where the car was registered, Karen's house. The total amount due was over $800 in fines, plus late fees and administrative costs. Karen came unglued when she saw the bill. She marched over to my house with the notice in hand, angrier than I'd ever seen her. She accused me of targeting her son and trying to ruin a teenager's life over parking disputes. She said I was taking my vendetta against her out on her child. I pointed out that her son was parking illegally, just like she had been. I also reminded her that she had specifically told me to handle parking issues with her son directly. So I was doing exactly what she had instructed. Karen's response was to scream that she hadn't meant for me to get her son in trouble with parking enforcement. She said it should have been obvious that she wanted me to talk to him about parking more considerately, not report him to the authorities. This was the perfect malicious compliance moment. I explained that she had never specified how I should handle the situation with her son. She had simply told me to deal with him directly about parking issues. Reporting parking violations to the appropriate authorities was indeed dealing with the problem directly. Karen demanded that I call parking enforcement and have the tickets dismissed. She said that if I didn't, she would make my life miserable. I told her that I had no authority to have tickets dismissed and that the parking enforcement office wouldn't take direction from me about which violations to enforce. I suggested she could try appealing the tickets through the proper channels if she believed they were issued in error. But here's where the story gets even better. While Karen was dealing with her son's parking tickets, Officer Martinez had been investigating the pattern of violations in our area. He had noticed that there seemed to be a systematic disregard for parking ordinances at the address where Karen lived. During his investigation, he discovered that Karen herself had several outstanding parking tickets that had never been paid. Some of these were from before she moved to our neighborhood, but others were from the tickets she'd accumulated during our parking dispute. It turned out that Karen had been ignoring many of the tickets, assuming they would just go away or that she could deal with them later. She had only paid some of them, usually the ones with the highest fines or the most persistent follow-up notices. Officer Martinez also discovered that Karen's vehicle registration had expired 2 months earlier. Driving with an expired registration is a separate violation from parking illegally, and it carries its own fines and consequences. The combination of unpaid parking tickets, her son's unpaid tickets, and the expired registration created what the city classified as a chronic compliance issue. Karen's household was flagged for enhanced monitoring and potential vehicle impoundment. The final straw came when Karen, frustrated by all the tickets and legal issues, decided to double down on her original strategy. She started parking her SUV in the problematic spot again, apparently believing that she had nothing left to lose. But this time, when Officer Martinez issued her a ticket, it wasn't just for parking too close to a driveway. It was also for operating a vehicle with expired registration. And because of her chronic violator status, the fine was significantly higher than previous tickets. More importantly, because her vehicle was flagged in the system as belonging to a chronic violator with outstanding fines, Officer Martinez was authorized to have the vehicle towed immediately rather than just issuing a ticket. Karen came home from grocery shopping to find her SUV gone. The impound fees, combined with all the outstanding parking ticket fines, the registration penalties, and the towing costs, came to just over $1,500. Karen had to pay the entire amount up front before the impound lot would release her vehicle. She also had to provide proof of current insurance and registration, which required additional fees and paperwork. The whole process took 3 days, during which Karen had no access to her primary vehicle. When she finally got her SUV back, Karen was a completely different person. She was no longer aggressive or confrontational. She seemed genuinely shocked by how expensive her parking behavior had become. Her husband came over to apologize on behalf of the family. He explained that they hadn't realized how serious the situation had gotten until they had to pay the impound fees. He said they would make sure all future parking was done legally and considerately. Karen herself never directly apologized, but she did start parking exclusively in her own driveway or in front of her own house. The problematic parking spot at the end of my driveway remained empty. The son, traumatized by having his car privileges revoked until he paid his share of the fines, became extremely careful about parking legally. He actually started asking neighbors if his parking was okay before leaving his car anywhere. The whole experience had cost Karen's family over $1,500 in fines, fees, and related costs. But more than that, it had made them notorious in the neighborhood as the family that didn't follow parking rules. Several neighbors mentioned to me that they'd heard about the situation and were glad someone had finally stood up to inconsiderate parking behavior. Officer Martinez told me later that our street had become one of the most compliant areas in his patrol zone. Word had gotten around about the consequences of parking violations, and most residents had become much more careful about following the rules. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen had started this whole conflict by insisting that she could park wherever she wanted because parking enforcement was practically non-existent in our neighborhood. Her refusal to follow basic parking courtesy had resulted in turning our street into one of the most heavily monitored areas for parking violations in the entire city. She had gotten exactly what she'd asked for. I had called parking enforcement all I wanted, just like she'd dared me to do. The fact that this had consequences she didn't anticipate wasn't my problem, as she might have said. Looking back, the entire situation could have been avoided if Karen had simply shown basic consideration for her neighbors from the beginning. All she had to do was park in a way that didn't block or impede access to my driveway. It wasn't a complicated request, and it wouldn't have cost her anything. Instead, she chose to escalate the situation at every opportunity, daring me to involve authorities and dismissing reasonable attempts at compromise. She had turned a simple parking courtesy issue into a months-long conflict that ultimately cost her family over $1,500 and earned them a reputation as problem neighbors. The whole experience taught me something important about dealing with unreasonable people. Sometimes the best response to someone who dares you to follow through on consequences is to do exactly that. Follow through completely and systematically. Karen had told me to call parking enforcement all I wanted. She had insisted that nothing would happen. She had dismissed the parking ordinances as stupid rules that didn't matter. So I had taken her at her word and treated her statements as instructions. I called parking enforcement every time I witnessed a violation, exactly as she'd suggested. I documented everything thoroughly and reported consistently, just like she'd dared me to do. The fact that this systematic compliance with her suggestions resulted in over $1,500 in fines and fees wasn't something I had planned or hoped for. It was simply the natural consequence of Karen's own choices and behavior. In the end, everyone got what they'd asked for. Karen got the maximum amount of parking enforcement attention she'd claimed I could never generate. I got a neighbor who finally parked considerately and legally, and our entire street got a reputation for strict parking compliance that has made it a much more orderly place to live. Sometimes, malicious compliance is the most effective way to deal with unreasonable demands. When someone dares you to do something they're convinced won't work, the best response might just be to do exactly that, completely, systematically, and without reservation. The best part? Karen never could complain that I hadn't done exactly what she'd told me to do. Anyway, thank you for watching. See you again tomorrow.